He found her drinking filthy water like a dog. He offered her a home, not knowing it would cost him everything. The rain had been falling for 3 days, turning the world into a canvas of grey and brown. It drummed a ceaseless, mournful rhythm on the roof of his small cottage, and turned the packed earth of his yard into a slick, grasping mud. Kaelen didn't mind the rain. It was a familiar companion in this lonely stretch of the borderlands, a constant that washed the world clean and kept most sensible folk, and the less sensible ones, away. He was hauling a bucket of slop for the pigs, the cold handle biting into his calloused palm, when he saw her. A shape, huddled and wrong, behind the low stone wall of the stables. It was the flicker of movement that caught his eye, a desperate, furtive motion that didn't belong to the wind or the rain. He set the bucket down, his heart giving a single, hard thump against his ribs. Trouble had a way of finding the quiet places. He had learned that lesson long ago, learned it in fire and loss, and had built this life of solitude to escape its memory. He wiped his wet hands on his wool trousers and moved slowly, his worn leather boots making soft, sucking sounds in the mud. As he drew closer, the shape resolved itself. An orc. A female by the look of her, though she was so caked in mud and grime it was hard to be certain. She was on her hands and knees, head bowed, drinking from a muddy puddle that had collected where the stable roof dripped. The sight was deeply unsettling. Not the fact that she was an orc. He saw them from a distance sometimes on the old trade road, but the sheer desperation of it. Like a stray animal, broken and run to ground. He stopped a dozen feet away, his hand hovering near the wood axe tucked into his belt. A precaution, nothing more. She must have sensed him, or perhaps the cessation of his footsteps alerted her. Her head snapped up. She was a ruin. One side of her face was a swollen, purpled mess, her eye nearly sealed shut. A deep, wicked-looking gash ran from her temple down her jaw, crusted with dirt and dried blood. Her armor, what was left of it, was a wreck of dented iron plates and broken leather straps. But it was her eyes, the one good one at least, that held him. It was a startling shade of amber, and it burned with a defiant fire that seemed utterly at odds with her wretched state. It was the eye of a cornered wolf. She pushed herself back, a low growl rumbling in her chest, a sound of pure, undiluted menace. Her hand went to the hilt of a short, brutal-looking sword still strapped to her hip. He could see the tremor in her arm, the exhaustion that warred with her will to fight. Kaelen raised his hands slowly, palms open, a gesture of peace. It felt foolish, standing in the pouring rain, trying to placate a wounded orc who looked like she could tear his throat at, exhaustion or no. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. The amber eye narrowed. She didn't believe him. He didn't blame her. "There's clean water inside," he offered, nodding toward his cottage. The smoke curling from its chimney was a thin, pale flag of warmth against the oppressive grey sky. And a fire. She just stared, her knuckles white on her sword hilt. The rain plastered her dark hair to her skull and ran in rivulets down her face, washing away some of the grime to reveal skin the colour of mossy stone. He saw the calculation in her eye, the weighing of risks. Stay here in the cold and wet, or trust the strange, solitary human. He knew what he should do. He should back away, go inside, bar the door, and wait for her to either die or move on. That was the smart thing to do. That was the safe thing to do. This was not his business. He had chosen this life specifically to have no business but the turning of the seasons and the needs of his small patch of land. But he looked at her, kneeling in the mud, and he didn't see an orc. He didn't see a monster or a threat. He saw the same desperate exhaustion he had once seen in the mirror, a lifetime ago. He saw a creature at the absolute end of its rope. "Look," he said, his voice softer this time. "You're hurt. You'll die out here." He took a small, deliberate step back, giving her space. "The door is open. There's food, a fire. No tricks." He turned his back on her. It was the most dangerous and the most honest thing he could do. Every step he took toward his cottage was an act of faith, a gamble that the sword she held would not find its home between his shoulder blades. He felt the weight of her stare on him, a physical pressure. He reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside without looking back. He left the door ajar. Inside, the small cottage was warm and smelled of wood smoke, drying herbs, and old wool. He moved to the hearth, adding a log to the fire. The flames leaped, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. He busied himself, pretending a calm he did not feel. He filled a ladle with water from the barrel by the door, his hands moving with the familiar, steady rhythm of his daily chores. His heart, however, was still hammering. He waited. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the steady drumming of the rain. He told himself it didn't matter. He had made the offer. If she didn't take it, that was her choice. He had done more than he should have already. A shadow fell across the doorway. She stood there, framed against the grey misery of the outdoors. She filled the small opening, her bulk seeming even greater now that she was upright. She leaned heavily against the doorframe, and in the firelight, he could see how badly she was trembling. Not from cold, but from sheer, bone-deep fatigue and pain. Her gaze swept the single room of his cottage, the simple wooden bed in the corner, the table and 2 chairs, the shelves lined with preserved vegetables and dried meat, the tools hanging neatly on the wall. Her eyes lingered on the axe by the door, then on him. He didn't speak. He just held out the ladle of clean water. She watched him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a pained, stiff movement, she limped inside, letting the door swing shut behind her. The sound of the latch clicking into place felt unnervingly final. She took the ladle from his hand, her fingers brushing his. Her skin was cold, but there was a surprising strength in her grip, a wiry tension that spoke of a life of struggle. She drank. She emptied the ladle in 3 long, desperate swallows, her throat working. When she was done, she held it out for more, her amber eye fixed on him. He refilled it. She drank again, and again. Only on the 4th ladle did she finally seem sated. She let out a long, shuddering breath and handed it back to him. "Thank you," she rasped. The words were gravelly, torn from her throat. It was the first thing she had said. "You're welcome," Kaelen replied, his own voice quiet. She swayed on her feet, and for a second he thought she would collapse. She caught herself, her hand bracing against the wall. Her gaze fell to the gash on her face, which had begun to weep sluggishly again. "That needs cleaning," he said, stating the obvious. She gave a short, harsh laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "It's one of many." "Sit," he said, pointing to the chair by the fire. She hesitated, her suspicion flaring again. To sit was to be vulnerable. To turn her back, even partially, was to offer an opening. "Lady, if I meant to kill you, I'd have used the axe when your back was turned in the yard," he said, his tone flat. "It would have been easier." The logic of it, grim as it was, seemed to land. She studied him for another heartbeat, then limped to the chair and lowered herself into it with a stifled groan. The firelight played over her face, making a landscape of shadows and highlights on her sharp, angular features. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her body. He moved to a small chest where he kept his meagre medical supplies, clean rags, a pot of foul-smelling herbal salve, and a needle and gut thread for stitching livestock. He brought them to the table, along with a bowl of hot water from the kettle hanging over the fire. He placed the supplies on the table beside her. He didn't move to touch her. He just set them down. A choice. She looked at the bowl, then at him. Her good eye was narrowed, questioning. "The water's hot," he said, "for cleaning the cut. The salve will keep the rot out." She picked up a rag, dipped it in the water, and flinched as she brought it to her face. She tried to clean the wound herself, her movements clumsy and pained. After a moment of watching her struggle, he spoke again, his voice quiet. "Let me." Her hand froze. Her head turned slowly, that single amber eye pinning him. It was a look of profound, dangerous mistrust. He expected a snarl, a refusal, another threat. Instead, after a long, tense silence, she gave a barely perceptible nod. He pulled the other chair closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He knelt in front of her, bringing himself lower, an act of submission in a way. He took the rag from her unresisting fingers. It was warm and wet. "This will sting," he said. She said nothing, just watched him. Gently, he began to clean the wound. He worked with the practiced care of a man used to mending things, broken fences, worn-out tools, sick animals. He cleaned away the mud and the clotted blood, revealing the true depth of the injury. It was deep, a clean slice that must have been made by a very sharp blade. It would need stitches. She didn't move a muscle, not a flinch, not a hiss of pain, though he knew it must have been agonizing. She just sat there, rigid as stone, her breathing slow and controlled. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, a fierce, vital warmth. He was acutely aware of her stillness, of the coiled power held in check just beneath the surface. He was tending to a predator, and he did not forget it. When the wound was clean, he picked up the needle and thread. He held it up for her to see. "It needs closing," he said. Her gaze flickered from the needle to his face. He saw a flicker of something in her eye, not fear, but a kind of weary resignation. She whispered one word, her voice like stones grinding together. "Go." He thought she meant for him to leave her be. He started to pull back, but her hand shot out and clamped around his wrist. Her grip was like iron, fast, brutal, even in her state. She could break his arm if she wanted to. "No," she rasped, her amber eye boring into his. "Stitch it." He understood then. "Go ahead." He nodded, his throat suddenly dry. He set to work, his fingers surprisingly steady. He pushed the needle through her tough, grey-green skin. The first stitch was the hardest. He expected her to react, but she remained perfectly still, her gaze locked on his face. She was watching him, studying him, taking his measure with an unnerving intensity. He worked in silence, the only sounds the hiss of the fire, the whisper of the thread through her skin, and the soft patter of the rain against the window pane. He put in 7 neat, tight stitches, closing the wound as best he could. When he was finished, he carefully applied a thick layer of his herbal salve over the line of black thread. He sat back on his heels, the task done. Her hand was still locked around his wrist. "There," he said quietly. She looked at his work, her expression unreadable. Then her gaze returned to his face. For a long moment they just stayed like that, knelt before her in the firelight, her hand a manacle on his arm. Then, slowly, her grip loosened. Her fingers slid away, leaving his skin cold where her touch had been. She leaned her head back against the chair and closed her good eye. The tension seemed to drain out of her, leaving her looking smaller, more fragile. The defiant warrior was gone, replaced by someone utterly spent. "Food," she murmured, the word barely audible. He got to his feet, his wrist tingling. He went to the pot simmering over the hearth and ladled a thick stew of rabbit and root vegetables into a wooden bowl. He handed it to her with a chunk of dark bread. She took it without a word and began to eat, slowly at first, then with a ravenous hunger that spoke of days without a proper meal. Kaelen watched her for a moment, then turned away and tended to his own needs. He ate his own stew standing by the hearth, his mind a whirl of questions. Who was she? What was she running from? And what in the hells had he just invited into his quiet, carefully constructed life? When he looked back, she was asleep. The empty bowl was on the floor beside her chair, her head lolled to one side, her breathing deep and even. The firelight softened the harsh lines of her face, and for the first time she looked almost peaceful. He had a choice to make. He could take her sword, bind her, and be safe, or he could let her rest. He looked at the stitches on her face, a neat black line against her skin. His work. He looked at the way her large hand rested, palm up and vulnerable, on the arm of the chair. He banked the fire for the night, took the worn wool blanket from his own bed and gently draped it over her. She stirred, a low growl starting in her throat, but she didn't wake. He backed away and settled himself into the other, less comfortable chair for the night, the wood axe resting on the floor within easy reach. Just in case. He didn't sleep much that night. The next few days fell into a strange, unspoken routine. The rain finally stopped, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening. Kaelen went about his chores, feeding the pigs, milking the goat, mending a section of fence that had been damaged in the storm. The orc, he still didn't know her name, remained. She spent most of the first day sleeping, a deep, healing slumber. When she was awake, she was silent and watchful. She would sit by the fire, her amber eye following his every move. The suspicion was still there, a palpable thing in the small cottage, but the sharp, aggressive edge had dulled. It was replaced by a quiet, waiting intensity. He didn't press her for information. He simply went about his life, treating her as if she were a natural part of it. He'd leave food and water on the table for her. He'd change the dressing on her face in silence, his touch gentle and professional. She allowed his care, her stillness a form of consent. On the third day, he woke to find the fire already lit. He had fallen asleep in his chair again, a crick in his neck his reward. He blinked in the early morning light and saw her standing by the hearth, feeding kindling into a merrily crackling blaze. She had taken the blanket he'd given her, folded it neatly, and placed it on the back of his chair. It was a small thing, a reciprocal act, but it felt significant, a shift in the delicate balance between them. Later that morning, he went out to the woodpile to split logs for the fire. The air was cold and crisp, smelling of wet earth and pine. He worked with a steady, practiced rhythm, the axe rising and falling, the crack of splitting wood a satisfying report in the quiet morning. After a while, he sensed her presence. She was standing near the cottage door, wrapped in his blanket against the chill. She was watching him work. He paused, resting the axe head on the chopping block. "Need something?" he asked. She shook her head. She just watched. After a moment, she walked over to the pile of split logs. With a slight grunt of effort, she bent down and began gathering them into her arms. She could carry 3 times what he could. She hauled the load back to the cottage and stacked the wood neatly by the hearth. Then she came back for more. They worked like that for an hour, in a comfortable, shared silence. He would split the logs, and she would carry and stack them. It was the first time she had contributed, the first time she had done anything other than simply exist in his space. It was a gesture, an acknowledgement. That evening, they sat at the small table, eating their stew. The silence was different now. It was less tense, more companionable. "You swing an axe well," she said, her voice still rough but stronger than before. "For a farmer." He shrugged, pushing a piece of turnip around his bowl. "My father taught me. Said a man who can't keep his own hearth warm is no man at all." She looked at the fire, then back at him. He was a wise man. "He was a farmer," Kaelen said simply. "Like me." He felt her gaze on him, and for the first time it didn't feel like an assessment of a threat. It felt like she was actually seeing him. "My name is Kaelen," he said, offering the piece of himself he had been withholding. She held his gaze for a long moment. He saw a flicker of internal debate in her eye. Trust was a hard-won thing in her world. He was beginning to understand. "Gauza," she finally said. Gauza. The name had weight. It sounded like stone and iron. It suited her. "Gauza," he repeated quietly. It felt strange to say it aloud. The next day, she found him in the small barn that doubled as his workshop, sharpening the blade of his scythe. The whetstone made a rhythmic shing, shing, shing sound against the steel. She stood in the doorway, watching, her arms crossed over her chest. Her face was healing well. The swelling was down, and the stitched gash was a clean, angry red line. She walked over and picked up a dented, rusted hand plough from a corner. "This is useless," she stated, her tone blunt. "I know," he said, not looking up from his work. "The handle's cracked, and the blade is dull as a river stone. I haven't had time to reforge it." "You have a forge," she said. It wasn't a question. She had clearly explored his small farmstead. "A small one," he admitted, "enough for tools and horseshoes, not for armor or swords." She ignored the implied distinction. She took his size from his hands, her grip sure and confident. She ran a thumb gently over the edge he had been working on. He tensed, but her touch was surprisingly delicate. "You have a good hand," she said, a note of approval in her voice. "Steady, patient." She handed the scythe back to him. Then she picked up her own broken armor, which had been lying in a heap by the door. She held up a cuirass plate that was bent almost in half, a deep gouge marring its surface. "Can you fix this?" she asked. He looked at the piece of steel. It was thick, far thicker than any metal he usually worked with. The craftsmanship was beyond anything he had ever seen up close. It was orc metal, known for its strength and resilience. "I can try," he said. "It won't be pretty. My forge isn't built for this kind of work." "It doesn't need to be pretty," she said, her voice hard. "It needs to work." So he fired the forge. The bellows creaked and groaned, breathing life into the coal. The small stone structure grew hot, the air thick with the smell of smoke and burning carbon. Gorza stood nearby, watching every step. She didn't offer advice, but her presence was a silent instruction. Do it right. He heated the dented plate until it glowed a furious orange. The heat was immense, far greater than what he needed for a simple tool. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. He lifted the heavy plate with his tongs, laid it on the anvil, and brought his hammer down. Clang! The sound was deep and resonant, a pure, ringing note that vibrated through the floor and up into his bones. The metal was stubborn, resisting the hammer. It was like striking a mountain. He had to put all of his weight, all of his strength into every blow. He worked for hours, heating, hammering, and quenching the steel. It was brutal, exhausting work. His muscles screamed in protest. But there was a rhythm to it, a conversation between the hammer, the steel, and the fire. He lost himself in it. Gorza never moved. She just watched, her amber eye reflecting the glow of the forge. She saw his sweat, his straining muscles, the focused determination on his face. He wasn't a warrior. He had no skill with a sword, but he knew how to work. He knew how to take something broken and, with patience and fire and sweat, make it whole again. Finally, it was done. The plate was straight. The gouge was gone, hammered out into a smooth, if slightly uneven, surface. It wasn't perfect. It bore the marks of his hammer, a testament to its rough repair. But it was strong. It was functional. He dropped the still warm plate onto a workbench, his arms trembling with exhaustion. He leaned against the anvil, breathing heavily. Gorza picked it up. She examined his work, turning it over and over in her hands. She ran her fingers over the hammered-out section. He braced himself for criticism. "It will hold," she said. It was the highest praise she could have given. That night, a quiet intimacy settled between them. She told him in clipped, sparse sentences of the betrayal, a cousin hungry for power, an ambush during a parley. She and a few loyal guards had fought their way free, but they had been separated in the ensuing chase. She had been running for weeks, harried and hunted. He, in turn, told her of his past. He had not always been a farmer. He had once lived in a town, had a wife. There had been a fire, a terrible accident born of a stupid border skirmish that had spilled into the streets. He had lost everything. He had come here to be forgotten. "We are both ghosts then," she had said, her voice low. "Maybe," he had replied, looking into the fire. "Or maybe we're just survivors." A few days later, while he was checking his snares in the woods that bordered his property, he found it. A track, a large booted footprint that did not belong to him. And another, then another. A group of at least 3, moving with purpose. His blood ran cold. He backtracked silently, his woodsman's senses on high alert. He didn't return directly to the farm. He circled wide, moving through the dense undergrowth until he could see his cottage from the cover of the trees. They were there, 3 of them. Orcs. They were big, much bigger than Gorza, and clad in heavy, spiked armor. They were moving cautiously, spreading out to surround the cottage. They were hunters, and they had found their quarry. He felt a surge of pure, primal fear. His first instinct was to run, to disappear into the woods and let them have her. This was her fight, not his. He had warned himself this would happen, but then he saw Gorza. She had emerged from the cottage, her repaired armor strapped on, her sword in her hand. She stood in the middle of the yard, waiting for them. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was facing them. And he knew he couldn't leave her. He had no sword, no armor, but he had his axe. And he knew this land. Every rock, every tree, every dip and rise in the terrain. This was his home. They were trespassing. He slipped away from his vantage point and began to circle, moving quickly and quietly through the woods. He came up behind the stables, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. One of the orcs was positioned there, using the stone wall for cover, his eyes fixed on Gorza. Kaelen took a deep breath. He was a farmer, not a warrior, but a cornered farmer could be a dangerous thing. He burst from behind the stables, not with a roar, but with a desperate, lunging charge. The orc heard him at the last second and started to turn, his ugly face a mask of surprise. Kaelen didn't hesitate. He swung the wood axe not like a weapon, but like the tool it was, putting all his momentum into a single, powerful blow aimed at the orc's unarmored knee. There was a sickening crunch of bone and a scream of agony. The orc went down, clutching his shattered leg. The sound alerted the other 2. They turned, and one of them started toward him, raising a massive, cleaver-like blade. Kaelen scrambled back, his courage failing him. The orc was a mountain of muscle and iron, and he was just a man with an axe. But he had bought her time. Gorza moved like a thunderbolt. She met the second orc's charge with a brutal efficiency that was terrifying to behold. Her sword was a blur of motion, a parry, a sidestep, a quick, vicious thrust under the orc's arm. The big warrior staggered, a look of disbelief on his face, before collapsing into the mud. The third orc, seeing his companions fall, hesitated. It was all the opening Gorza needed. She was on him in 3 long strides, her attack relentless. It was over in seconds. He was a farmer. She was a storm. Silence fell over the yard, broken only by the groans of the orc with the shattered leg and Kaelen's own ragged breathing. Gorza stood over the last body, her chest heaving. She turned to look at him, her amber eye wide. She looked at the axe in his hand, then at the downed orc by the stables. She walked over to the groaning survivor. She looked down at him with cold fury, raised her sword, and ended his misery with a single, brutal thrust. She was not a farmer. Then she came to Kaelen. He flinched as she approached, the bloody sword still in her hand. He was suddenly terrified of her again. He had just seen what she was capable of. She stopped in front of him. She looked at his pale, frightened face, at the axe held in his white-knuckled grip. Then she did something he never expected. She reached out and gently took the axe from his hands. She set it down on the ground. Then her hand, still sticky with blood, came up and rested on his shoulder. "You stayed," she said, her voice filled with a strange, wondering quality. "It's my farm," he managed to say, his voice trembling. "No," she said, her gaze intense. "You stayed. For me." The quiet didn't last. They both knew this was just a scouting party. The main force would not be far behind. "More will come," he said, stating the grim reality. "Yes," she agreed. "Kargun is not subtle. He will send everyone." "Kargun?" "My cousin," she said, the name a curse on her lips. "The one who wants my head." She looked around the small farm, at the cottage with its plume of smoke, at the neatly stacked firewood, at the bodies now staining the mud. "He will burn this place to the ground to get to me." A cold dread settled in Kaelen's stomach. His home, this quiet sanctuary he had built from the ashes of his old life. All of it was now in the path of a storm he had willingly invited inside. He felt a wave of despair, followed by a hot surge of anger. At Kargun, at Gorza, at himself. "You should have told me," he said, his voice low and tight. "You should have told me you were a chief, or whatever you are, that you had an army hunting you." Gorza's expression hardened. "And what would you have done, farmer? Turned me away to die in the rain?" "Maybe," he shot back, the word tasting like ash. "It would have been the smart thing to do." The hurt that flashed in her eye was so swift he almost missed it. It was quickly masked by her usual stoic pride, but he had seen it. He had wounded her, and the knowledge brought him no satisfaction, only a hollow ache. "My life is not your burden, Kaelen," she said, her voice cold as iron. "I will leave. You will be safe." She turned to go, to walk away and face her fate alone. But before she could take a step, a new sound reached them. The sound of a horn, deep and mournful, echoing from the woods. It was too late. They came from the trees, not as a scouting party, but as a war band. At least 20 of them, clad in the same dark, spiked iron. They moved with a grim, disciplined purpose, their faces set in hard lines. At their head was an orc of immense size, his armor more ornate, his face a roadmap of old scars. A jagged white scar ran through one of his eyes, giving him a predatory, half-blind look. "Kagen," Gorza breathed, her hand tightening on her sword. Kaelen felt his world shrink to the small, muddy yard of his farm. This was it, the end of his peace, the end of everything. "Gorza!" Kagen's voice boomed across the clearing, a sound full of gravel and arrogant command. "You have led me a merry chase, cousin, but it ends here, in this human's mud pit." His gaze swept over Kaelen, dismissing him as nothing more than an insect. "Surrender, and I will grant your pet a quick death." Kaelen's fear was a cold, solid thing in his gut, but Kagen's casual, contemptuous dismissal of him sparked something else, a stubborn, defiant anger. This was his home, his mud pit. "We can't fight them all," he said to Gorza, his voice low. "No," she agreed, her eyes never leaving Kargun. "I will buy you time. Run. Go through the back of the barn, into the woods. You know the paths." She was offering him an escape, the one he should have taken days ago. But the thought of running now, of leaving her to face them alone, was impossible. It was a betrayal he couldn't commit. "No," he said, his voice surprisingly firm. He picked his axe back up from the ground. It felt small and inadequate, but it was his. "I'm not leaving." A flicker of surprise and something else, something warmer, passed through her amber eye. "Then stand with me," she said. The battle was a whirlwind of chaos, noise, and pain. It was nothing like the brief skirmish before. This was a brutal, overwhelming assault. Kargun's warriors surged forward, and the yard became a maelstrom of flashing steel and guttural war cries. Kaelen didn't fight like a warrior. He fought like a cornered animal on his own territory. He used his knowledge of the farm to his advantage. He kicked over a bee skep, unleashing a furious swarm on a pair of attackers. He ducked into the barn and toppled a heavy stack of hay bales onto another, crushing him. He fought with his axe, his pitchfork, his fists, anything to survive. But mostly, he stayed close to Gorza. She was the center of the storm, a whirlwind of deadly grace. Her sword sang a song of death, each movement precise, each blow fatal. They fought back to back, a strange and desperate pairing, the exiled warrior chief and the quiet farmer. He would fend off an attacker who tried to flank her, his clumsy but desperate blows buying her the second she needed to turn and finish them. They were good. They were better than Kargun had expected, but they were outnumbered, hopelessly so. A flaming arrow thudded into the thatched roof of the cottage, then another. The dry straw caught instantly. Flames began to lick up the side of his home, smoke billowing into the grey sky. The sight of it breaking, of his small, quiet world being consumed by fire, broke something inside him. He took a blow to the side, a glancing strike from a warhammer that cracked his ribs and sent a blinding sheet of pain through his body. He staggered, the axe falling from his numb fingers. An orc loomed over him, grinning, raising his weapon for the final blow. Gauze's sword took the orc's head from his shoulders. She hauled Kaelen to his feet, her face grim. "It's over," she yelled over the roar of the fire and the din of battle. "We have to fall back." The barn was their only hope. They retreated into its dusty, shadowed interior, barring the heavy wooden door behind them. The sounds of the battle were muffled now, replaced by the ominous crackle of the burning cottage and the splintering thuds of axes against the barn door. Kaelen slumped against a wall, clutching his side. Every breath was agony. He watched as the flames from the cottage cast flickering, hellish light through the cracks in the barn walls. His home. Gone. Everything he had built, everything he had hidden himself in, was turning to ash. Gauze stood by the door, listening. She was wounded too, a deep cut on her arm bleeding freely, her breathing ragged. But her will was unbroken. "There's a back way out," Kaelen rasped, pointing to a small, low door used for mucking out the stalls. "It leads to the woods." She nodded, but she didn't move toward it. Instead, she turned to face him. Her expression was solemn, her amber eye burning with a fierce intensity in the fire-lit gloom. "Kaelen," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. The main doors of the barn groaned, the wood beginning to splinter. They didn't have much time. "Before we go," she continued, her voice ringing with a formal public weight, as if she were speaking not just to him, but to the ancestors and the world itself. "Kargun called you my pet. He is wrong. He does not see you." She took a step closer, her shadow looming over him. "I see you," she declared, her voice resonating with power. "I see the man who gave a wounded enemy shelter. I see the man who tended her wounds, who shared his fire and his food. I see the craftsman who mended her armor with patient hands. I see the farmer who stood and fought against an army for a woman he barely knew." The barn door splintered, a huge crack appearing down the middle. "I am Gauze, daughter of Garlak, blood chief of the Stonefang clan," she announced, and the name echoed with the weight of history. "And I claim you, not as a pet, not as a servant. I offer you a place, beside me, as my mate, my partner, to stand with me, to build with me, to lead my people with me when we retake what is ours." He stared at her, stunned into silence. Through the pain and the smoke and the terror, her words were a clear, impossible bell. It was an offer of a life he could never have imagined, a life of danger, of war, of belonging. He thought of his burning cottage, of the ashes of his quiet life. There was nothing left for him here. He looked at her, at the blood and grime on her face, the fierce loyalty in her eyes, the unwavering strength in her stance. She was offering him not just survival, but a purpose. But he was not a pet. He was not a prize to be claimed. He pushed himself painfully to his feet, ignoring the fire in his ribs. He stood tall, or as tall as he could, and met her gaze. He was just a man, a human, smaller, weaker, but he had his own kind of strength. "I will not hide behind you, Gorza," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "I will not be your human mate that you keep safe in the back of the camp. If I come with you, I come as I am, a farmer, a craftsman, a man. I will stand beside you, not behind you. Your people will see me as I am, or they will not see me at all." It was his condition, his terms. He was choosing this, not just being swept along by it. A slow, fierce smile spread across Gorza's face. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile. It transformed her. "Then stand," she said. The barn doors burst open. They did not flee through the small back door. They charged out the main entrance together. Gorza, with a furious roar, met Kagan's warriors head-on. Kaelen, his mind strangely clear, did not charge into the fray. He grabbed a lit lantern, smashed it against a pile of dry straw near the entrance, and the entire front of the barn went up in a sheet of flame, creating a wall of fire between them and half of Kagan's force. Chaos erupted. In the confusion, a new sound emerged, the pounding of hooves. A small group of orc warriors, 4 of them, all female, crashed out of the woods, tearing into the flank of Kagan's forces. Gorza's loyalists. They had found her. The tide had not turned, but it had paused. It was the opening they needed. One of the female warriors, a fierce-looking orc with a scarred face, fought her way to Gorza's side. "Chief, we came as fast as we could." "Urzga, well met," Gorza yelled back. "We leave, now." Urzga glanced at Kaelen, her expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion, but she said nothing. She was loyal to Gorza, and Gorza had made her stand. They fought a brutal, desperate retreat, cutting a path through the disoriented warriors. Gorza and her retainers formed a protective wedge around Kaelen, whose ribs screamed with every jarring step. They reached the tree line and plunged into the shadows of the forest, leaving the sounds of battle and the sight of Kaelen's burning farm behind them. They ran until the sounds of pursuit faded, until Kaelen's legs gave out and he collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, the world spinning in a haze of pain. Gorza was there, kneeling beside him, her hand on his shoulder. Her other warriors stood watch, a grim, silent circle. He looked back in the direction of his farm. A pillar of dark smoke twisted into the sky, a funeral pyre for the life he had lost. It was all gone. "I'm sorry, Kaelen," Gorza said, her voice soft. "For your home." He shook his head, wincing. "A house is just wood and stone," he said, the words tasting hollow even to him. "I can build another." He looked at her. "I chose to stand." Her hand tightened on his shoulder. "Yes," she said, "you did." The days that followed were a blur of hardship and movement. They travelled hard and fast, Gorza's small band of loyalists leading them through hidden paths and desolate country. Kaelen was a liability. His cracked ribs made every breath a trial, and his human stamina couldn't match the relentless pace of the orcs. He saw the way Gorza's warriors looked at him, Erzga, the scarred second-in-command, was the most openly skeptical. She saw him as a weakness, a soft-skinned burden their chief had inexplicably taken on. They didn't understand. They saw a human farmer, limping and slow, and they couldn't reconcile that with the declaration Gorza had made in the heat of battle. But Gorza's word was law. They protected him, shared their meagre rations with him, and said nothing. Gorza herself never left his side for long. She would help him over difficult terrain, her strength a steady presence. At night she would change the dressing on his side and share her blanket with him, their bodies huddled together for warmth against the cold mountain air. In those quiet moments, he began to see the leader in her. She was not just a warrior, she was a chief. She listened to the reports from her scouts, made decisions with swift certainty, and cared for her warriors with a fierce, maternal protectiveness. They were not just her soldiers, they were her family, what was left of it. And he, somehow, was part of that now. He did what he could to not be a burden. When a strap on Erzga's armor broke, he repaired it with a bit of cord and a woodsman's knot that was stronger than the original stitching. When their water skins ran low, he found a small, hidden spring by spotting the type of moss that only grew near fresh water. He sharpened their dulled knives and axes with a flat river stone, his hands steady and sure. They were small things, farmers' tricks, craftsmen's skills, but they were useful. Erzga's skepticism didn't vanish, but he saw a grudging respect begin to dawn in her eyes. He was not a warrior, no, but he was not useless. They finally made it to their destination, a hidden camp in a high, secluded valley where the rest of Gorza's scattered clan had taken refuge. It was a motley collection of about 50 orcs, old warriors, young mothers, children, the survivors of Kagan's purge. His arrival caused a stir. A human, and not a slave or a prisoner, a human walking beside their chief. He felt hundreds of eyes on him, a heavy weight of mistrust and suspicion. Gorza's word had gotten him this far, but here, among her people, he would have to earn his place. He knew he could never earn it with a sword, so he did it with his hands. The camp was in disarray. Their tools were broken, their shelters were leaky, their weapons were poorly maintained. So he went to work. He built a proper forge, better than the one he'd had at his farm, using clay from the riverbank and flat stones from the scree slope. He began to repair their things. He reforged axe heads, straightened bent spear points and mended cooking pots. He showed them how to build a smokeless fire, how to cure meat so it would last through the winter, how to rig a simple pulley system to haul heavy logs. He worked from sunup to sundown, his hands and his knowledge his only currency. He didn't speak much, he just worked. And slowly, very slowly, he felt the camp's attitude toward him begin to shift. They stopped seeing him as the human and started seeing him as Kaelen, the man who could fix things. The mothers would bring him their broken pots, the old warriors their notched blades. Even Erzga came to him one day with a dented helmet, setting it down before him without a word. He had fixed it for her, and she had given him a stiff, formal nod of thanks. It was a victory. Gorza gave him the space to find his own footing. She was busy, consumed with the duties of a chief, planning their eventual return, their counter-attack against Kaelen. But he felt her eyes on him often. He would look up from the forge and find her watching him, a quiet, proud look on her face. One evening, months after they had arrived, she came to the forge. He was finishing his work for the day, banking the fire. The camp was settling down for the night, the air filled with the smells of roasting meat and wood smoke. "I need your help," she said. She led him to her tent, the largest in the camp. Inside, laid out on a wooden chest, was her armor. The cuirass he had repaired back at his farm, and the other pieces, all scarred and dented from a dozen battles.
"We march in 3 days," she said. "Kargan's position is weaker than he thinks. We have a chance to take it back." She turned to him. "I need my armor to be ready. I need you to make it ready." He looked at the armor, then at her. This was more than a repair job. This was a ritual, an anointing. "I will," he said. He spent the next 2 days at the forge, working only on her armor. He didn't just fix it, he improved it. He reforged the weakest plates, redesigned the pauldrons for better movement, and replaced the broken leather straps with new, stronger ones. He polished the steel until it shone with a dark, menacing luster. It was the finest work he had ever done. On the morning they were to march, she stood before him as he fastened the final buckle. He was fitting the cuirass, the very piece he had first hammered straight in his own forge a lifetime ago, into place. The small tent was quiet, the sounds of the war camp bustling outside. His hands moved with a familiar certainty, securing the straps. It was a mirror of that first tense encounter in his cottage when he had stitched her face. But now there was no fear, no suspicion. There was only a deep, quiet trust. As he tightened the last buckle on her side, his hand brushed against hers. He stopped. He looked up and met her gaze. Her amber eye was soft, all its hard warrior edges smoothed away for this one moment. He had lost his home, his peace, his entire world. But standing here, in this tent, on the eve of a battle for the soul of a people he had never known, he felt more at home than he ever had in his quiet solitude. He was not a ghost anymore. He was seen. He had chosen, and he had been chosen in return. He was a farmer, a craftsman, a man who had found his purpose not in the soil of a lonely field, but in the heart of a storm. "It will hold," he said quietly, his voice full of a meaning that went far beyond the steel plate. Gorza's hand closed over his. "I know," she said. Did you enjoy the story? Subscribe to the channel to watch more stories like this one. Leave a like, it helps the channel a lot. And drop a comment down below. I always read them and use your feedback to make our content better. Thanks so much. Orc-Bound Legacy.